Welcome to your Get That Nugget for GCSE English Language. Today we'll be concentrating on giving you a framework to answer Paper 1, Question 5, the writing question. This session is to complement your lessons with your teachers and not to replace them in any way. So if you remember in the previous nugget for this question, we looked at an image and how we approach an image question to make sure we've got a secure response so that we can write. I also showed you a planning structure and went through each part of the planning structure in order for you to have a really good secure response. Now, I also did mention in the previous nugget that although I've done some notes, your planning should be much more detailed. You're not using a planning sheet to write your response, you are using it to plan. So you do need to use things like bullet points, some one words, some couple of sentences if you prefer, but you should also be using what kind of techniques and vocabulary that you would like to use in your piece as well. As I said before, the more detailed your planning sheet is, the better your response is going to be. Please do also remember that in the exam you are not going to have time to do this. Obviously you won't have the sheet, but the more practice you can get using this structure, the easier this part is going to be, because essentially that's all you've got to remember for this question is those 6 parts. And if you can then write a response with those 6 parts, you've covered everything that you need to do to make sure that you're going to be effective, as long as you've done obviously each part effectively. Okay, so what I would like to do is I want to show you how to turn your planning sheet into something that is a full answer. Now obviously we don't have time to do the full response with you today, but I'm going to choose to do the opening and then the flashback, because the flashback or the time shift seems to be the one thing that people do get quite confused at. And obviously we want to showcase our ability and showcase our talents, and we want to make sure that we're getting that flashback in, because we're showing a real good sense of structural technique there, and we're also making sure our examiner is engaged. So all we need to do is we take our plan and then we turn that into sentences. Now, if your plan is as detailed as it should be, this won't take long to write. It actually will probably take you less time to write than it has to plan if you've planned it correctly. Obviously in the exam you are going to spend more time writing, but remember that the whole idea is that in the exam you have 10 minutes to plan, you have about 30 to write, and then you must keep those 5 minutes to proofread over what you've written. Okay, so we start with an opening line. So let's keep it really simple, and I've gone with "it all started here." Quite vague, but it's quite interesting. And what I will do is, if I was writing the whole piece, I would then use the same sort of sentence but change slightly for the end. So for the end I might write something like "all ended here" or something similar. Again, quite a simple sentence. I haven't used any fancy vocabulary or anything like that. You can do something much more effective. This is just for purposes of this nugget. So if we recall back to our plan, the first section is our current scene. So we need to make sure that within this paragraph, we've got some description and some imagery. And we also have a little bit of a sense of what our character. Now I've chosen to use the man in the image, if you remember, the man there, just because I think a lot of the time to write in first or third person is much easier. And it's much easier if you just write about one person. I think I did mention that in the nugget previously. Let's try to stick to one. So let's go for our description first, and I'll then break down the paragraph with you to show you exactly how it should or how it is effective. So let's go with some imagery. So deep blue, ripples, because we're going to start with the lake. So ripples of ice cold water. See how I'm not just saying, oh, the lake is cold. And I'm going to put call to him like a siren. I've not just put deep blue ripples of the cold. I've not just put deep blue ripples of ice cold water. I've then added something additionally to that, and I've used a simile. I've also not just put blue ripples of the ice cold lake. Like, I've not called it a lake, I've said water, and that's also more descriptive than just saying the lake is cold and it's blue. That's telling me something rather than showing me something. I want you to show me the lake rather than just say it is a lake, because that's far more effective. Okay, I'm going to keep it quite simple and just do a sentence for the lake. And then I'm going to talk about the sky, because I want to show you how we can transition from one thing to another. So let's go with the clouds now, and let's go with monotonous. So I'm trying to use some interesting vocabulary. And the thing with vocabulary is if you learn 5 to 10 really interesting words, they can then be used for any image. Not only can you feel a bit better that you've got something prepared, you also can then learn how to spell them correctly if you're not a great speller, but you will then be able to feel much more comfortable when you're in that exam, and you can make sure they're used in the correct way. There's nothing worse than writing something that with words that don't make sense, and your examiner will spot that really easily, and you don't want that. So my advice would be to learn 5 to 10 words. You know what they mean, you know how to use them, and you know how they're spelled. Monotonous is a good one. It's also one that not a lot of people use correctly, so I would think about that as well. So monotonous, clouds. And then I'm going to try and use some sort of aspect of military. So we're going to go with march together like an army. So we've got another simple simile in there. March together like an army, preparing for battle. Eager to shoot down enemies in their way. Now, essentially, all I've said is it's cloudy and the clouds are full of rain. But look how I've taken that and then made it better. So I've said grey clouds still, but I've talked about them being monotonous. I've talked, because there's a lot of them and they're boring, they're dull. I've talked about how they march together. I've personified them. I've said they're like an army. I've said they're preparing for battle. I've talked about them shooting down enemies in their way. Essentially, those sentences basically say it's raining or it's about to rain. And this is the difference between showing and telling. And you need to have that distinct impression in your writing where you're using that imagery to really create the scene and set the setting for your examiner. But you're also showing them that you are more than able and more than capable of writing well. They're not expecting you to be a writer. They're not expecting you to be a best-selling author. They're expecting you to use your skill to be effective and creative in what you are writing. And that's quite an important thing to remember. Let's do a couple more sentences. So envelope, another great word. I would recommend that being one of your top words that you use. It's such a good one to use. So envelope in sadness. His tears fall as droplets of iced rain thunders around him. So basically all of those words to say that it rains. And it's about the quality of your writing, not the quantity. So just because I've used more sentences, I've actually thought concisely and probably a bit more than it looks about the words that I'm using. And this is the difference. If you wrote, and that's why we've kept the 6 paragraphs, if you wrote 1.5 to 2 pages and the quality is like this, that's far better than you writing 5 pages, because that is actually going to bore your examiner. They're going to zone out and they're going to mark it, but they're not going to be impressed. Whereas if you think about each and every word being considered and you've really thought about how they're going to be effective, that is far more effective as a whole piece than anything else that you could do. Please try and remember that. And that's why planning is so important. You need to make sure you're choosing your words carefully, because they will have a much bigger impact than you think they will do. Okay, so then we're going to go to a little bit about how he's feeling. So is he too late? Let's get a little rhetorical question in there. And then let's think about ending it on something quite simple. So is he too late? He's here for answers. See how we're mentioning that he's there for a reason. We've not gone into detail. Let's withhold a bit of information from the reader, but there are none for him. Okay, and of course you can make that much more detailed. You can have some one-word sentences in there. You can have some fancy vocab in there. You can talk about him for a little bit more. You can talk about the setting a little bit more. But I want to show you how we then go into a contrast with a second paragraph for our time shift. I'm not going to write the whole thing because we'll run out of time, but it's better to just go straight into it. So I'm going to go with laughter echoes through his racing mind. He gets lost in the sound. Rhythmic dance in his ears only. So immediately, I'm obviously not talking about my current setting, my current situation, because I've talked about how miserable it is. I'd obviously have gone into much more detail than I have done here, but I've gone into something that's quite positive. I may even introduce someone else. So her smile, let's go with another person. Her smile floods his thoughts. I may look at things like the setting in here as well. So sun rays. Reflect off the picture perfect lake. Again, it's really clear that I'm not looking or I'm not describing the image as it currently is. And I'm not talking about the same paragraph. I'm not saying about the same things. I'm actually gone with a contrast. And this is why it's much easier to write about something completely miserable so that your flashback can be super happy or a happier version. This is also quite a good space to do some of your sensory language as well. Sensory language is really effective, and it's very effective in the first and second paragraph in particular. So let's just end this on sense of summer. Pierce his senses. This is his happiness. Again, I've kept it quite simple, and there are other things that you can do that make that much better than what I've written. But as a secure answer, actually, that is secure, and I have written what I needed to write. The reason I did that is to show you that, as I said, this is a massive contrast, but what you don't want is just to say something simple like my memory comes back, or his memory comes back, or he remembers. Keep that whole idea of I don't want you to tell me, I don't want you to tell that examiner, I want you to show me, describe it to me. So this is a complete contrast. I know that that's a complete flashback to another time, and your examiner will too. Then you obviously will have something that brings them out of that, and I think this is the most important thing I'm going to show you, because this, when something happens, it's really easy to fall into the trap of just doing some sort of sound and that's it, and that loses the impact that the rest of this has. So my advice to you would be to use a noise or a bit of an action that happens, but keep it quite simple within the description. So let's go with winds mercilessly, lovely little word, disrupt the trees behind him, jolting him away from his sweet embrace. Again, there is lots of different words that you could use. There's lots of different things that are a bit more effective, but for the purposes of the nugget, I want to show you just how that looks. So you can see this already, we're halfway through the plan. We've got our opening sentence, we've got our paragraph 1, we've got our paragraph 2, and we've got our paragraph 3, and that is a page worth. And as I said, you can add much more detail to what you've got already, and the more you've got on your plan, the better. But I think it's very important to then look at how does that then match to our writing in our mark scheme. Now, quite clearly, we've gone past level 1. It's not simple and limited. We're way beyond that. We are also beyond some sustained attempt to match register to audience. We're beyond conscious use of vocabulary. We are conscious, but we are a bit beyond that, because we actually tried to do something more. We've tried to use the idea of those linguistic devices and structural devices to create a bigger impact. So we've hit all of those, which means we're then into level 3, which is where we wanted to be. So register is generally matched to audience. It is matched to the audience. If we'd written more, that would be more obvious, but it's matched to the purpose. We've clearly chosen, and that's the key phrase, we've clearly chosen for effect our vocab and our linguistic devices. So we've already hit that. So that means we're up here now, we're in the upper level 3. And depending on what else you had written for the whole piece, we are in that secure level, because we've communicated really clearly, and we are also consistently clear. We haven't just got one good paragraph. So far, half of it is all clear. And if we'd written the rest of it, it would be consistently clear. So my advice to you would be take the planning sheet that you used for the image and write a piece for your teacher to mark. I'm sure they'll be really happy to mark it for you. Equally, I'm just going to remind you of these 6 paragraphs, and you can always plan from scratch, which is a very good effective way of doing it. The more practice the better. A different image, something completely different, and then plan that and then write a response for your teacher. But just to recap: current scene, flashback, something happened, back to present, zoom in on a key detail, and then link back to the beginning. I'm sure if you gave that to your teacher, they'd be more than happy to mark it for you and give you some feedback.